Right, I'm Ruben from the Ruby Tuesday. I'm here with the amazing Jonathan Hartman. The way I like to start is obviously ask you to introduce yourself and just a little bit about yourself, about composing really, and then I'm going to ask you some interesting questions. I hope that you haven't had too many times before.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Ruben. I really appreciate being here. I'm Jonathan Hartman. I'm a composer for film and television and a massive science fiction and fantasy nerd, all the way back to childhood. And now I'm kind of living in a world where all those hobbies and interests from childhood are kind of blurring with my musical career in really fun ways. And that's kind of what I'm doing these days.
Fantastic. Before I ask about a few of the extra geeky things I want to ask about, um, did you always foresee yourself becoming a composer? Where did that journey start for you?
That's a good question. I started actually as a saxophonist, as a performing musician. And the kind of way that I got into this is that my grandfather was an engraver of musical instruments, right? And so he was the master engraver at a place called King Musical Instruments, and he did horns for all the world's most famous jazz musicians, like Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, etc. And so I actually grew up meeting a lot of those people who, when they were still alive as a kid, and got very interested in jazz music at a young age and started performing and like 15, 16 in clubs and so forth.
Yeah.
But all throughout that time, I was always writing and arranging for different things. So even when I was in high school, for example, I had gone and written a large number of arrangements for full wind ensembles or, small symphony groups, big bands. And by the time I'd even gone to university, I had already done something like 20 arrangements and written. So it was always something that was cooking in the background. And it took a while before I kind of realized that actually, yeah, maybe I wanted to get off the road and not be like playing gigs every single night and more writing and composing. And it just kind of was a natural shift over.
How do you choose your projects, or is it at first you just kind of take what you can get, and then you kind of, I guess you build up a backlog?
Yeah, and so certainly in the early stages of your career, yeah, it is a bit whatever comes your way. My mentor was Ira Newborn, who did all these great 80s movies like Naked Gun and 16 Candles and Pretty in Pink, and he got me into this business and is still a dear friend to this day. And he used to joke that, he said, in the early parts of your career, it's like waiting alongside a river and different barges will come by and you just have to eventually decide to step on one, and wherever that goes downstream is kind of what's going to happen, right? And so certainly in the beginning, you kind of take whatever's comes your way. And I'd done a fair amount of like kind of like crime thriller stuff early in my career. I never really did any straight up horror movies per se. But what I found is like in the early part of my career, after a while, I felt like there was like a side to my life that was like my kind of nerd centric side that had always been there. My love of comic books and role playing games and Dungeons and Dragons and Warhammer and all those kinds of things, and sci-fi pulp paperbacks and just a ton of that kind of stuff. And I just always felt like I kept it like private or something, and like here was my work life and then here was my private life. And about 7 years ago, I kind of realized, no, you just start flying that flag a little bit higher. And interestingly enough, like people respond, and I just started finding more and more jobs coming to me that were genre kind of things that I loved, the kinds of things I grew up obsessed with. And I was really happy, more than happy, just to kind of start doing more and more of the science fiction stuff, the fantasy stuff, the supernatural stuff. Uh, it's really an incredible joy to do the same kind of things you grew up loving and watching, and now to be a part of those kinds of things.
Yeah, talking about the supernatural stuff, there's a Netflix series that you did called Superstition, which I loved, and I was so gutted when it wasn't picked up. Um,
Oh,
I thought the scoring, the composition in that was so good. I recently interviewed one of the directors. I think he did 2 episodes.
would
Um,
you, uh,
I've got a what's his name?
John? Hammond?
Yes, he directed the miniseries of the June miniseries.
That's right. He's an amazing director. John directed, I think, like episode like 5 and 7 for us or something like that. He was lovely to work with. He's really sharp. Um, yeah, I'm glad. Thank you for those kind words about the show. It's definitely one of those things that uh, I think that we all would have loved to have had maybe one more season or another season after that to see where it would go. Um, it's funny because I feel like it's interesting. Speaking with Brits, I noticed that it seemed like it got a stronger reaction on Netflix internationally than maybe it domestically here in the United States on the Sci-Fi Channel. Uh, I was once on a train, East Midlands Railway, heading up to Nottingham, and I was in a random car with somebody, and somehow we got chatting, and I said, "Oh yeah, I did this show, Superstition. You know, you probably didn't see it." She's like, "Oh my God, that's one of my most favorite shows." Blah 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 blah. And it wasn't like just lip service. Like, "Oh, I love in episode 3 where the cowboy guy showed up, and I like doing this." And I was like, "Wow, like I always thought like you were the one person who saw it, but like." Well, it's really great that the reaction has always been so strong that people feel passionately about it, and I think they do because it's like at its heart, it's a really like a family drama that's got like a supernatural framework around it, as opposed to just being like a generic, fantasy supernatural kind of show.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of what I compared it to, supernatural but more family orientated, which I think that what I really enjoyed about it. And not too long after that, you did a dark web, which I knew about but I hadn't seen until today. I watched a couple of episodes in preparation for this, and I have to say that the composing is very eerie. I do wonder how you go about, like what is your process? And a double question really is there ever any fear to when you start creating, going, I don't have it anymore?
Oh, every single time, every single time. So I'll answer your second question first. Every single time. So my wife is used to this now, and she guides me through it. Day 1, day 2, I'll sit and stare at blank paper and blank screen for like 8 hours, and I'll start to freak out and go, "Oh, I've forgotten how to write music. Oh man, I can't. I've oversold myself here. Like, what have I done?" Right? I go home and I'll be really distraught about it, and my wife will go, "Give it a day or two," and then the second day I'll have like a little tiny, just little bit of something, a little atom of something. I'll go, it wasn't as bad as yesterday. And then day 3 typically is like, "Oh, I found a thing. I think I figured it out. I think this is the sound of the show. I remembered how to write music," right? And I don't know why I still go through that process on literally every single gig, but I still go through that process on every single gig. And I think partly too is because I feel really passionately that every job should have its own unique sense of character and musical sensibility. And I really feel strongly like I don't ever want to feel like I just do my greatest hits and kind of phone it in, just to do a thing. And so kind of trying to do some of that digging and that work takes a while, and frankly, sometimes you go through some creative dead ends and go, "Oh, no, that's not the show at all. It's this, or it's this way." But as far as then the actual show itself on Dark Web, yeah, that's a really creepy score. Like, it's got a very unnerving. It's not like a horror movie kind of score. It's not a jump scare kind of thing. It's just got this never-ending sense of dread, because the dark web is kind of like that. Like, do you really want to peek behind the curtain? Do you really want to see what's there? Do you really want to know? Because yeah, that show in many ways, early conversations on, I felt like the way to go with that would be kind of inspired by things I grew up loving, like John Carpenter scores, or like Tangerine Dream kind of scores, like They Live and The Thing, and things that just you kind of walk away from going, "Oh, I don't, I don't feel good." Um, and also for that show in particular, because it was like a cyber thriller and kind of rooted in the internet, and kind of rooted in a slightly retro sensibility. That was actually a big turning point in my own kind of creative process, because that was where I started getting into like analog synthesizers and classic pieces of kit and gear. And I went down a rabbit hole of just getting more and more stuff like this. And that was really the starting point for me with that kind of creative direction, was that show and their kind of encouragement of that as the producers.
Which leads me to ask about Warhammer. And so I listened to the little bit I was given. I would love to hear more. But it's very grand. I saw like you've got a whole orchestra, and it sounds like I want it to sound. If that makes sense. I love I was probably one of the few people that really loved the live action film, and mostly also because of the visual expertise and the score. So when it came to this, I was so happy to see that this animation was going to get a really grand scale, really epic.
Yeah. It's been absolutely incredible. So I've been a massive Warhammer fan since I was a kid, right? Like, I've been in this since the very beginning of Warhammer 40,000, and so it was one of these things when Angels of Death, Bowman Modine was one of the producers and directors on Angels of Death, and I'd known Bowman for many years. And he came to me and he said, I'm going to do this thing with Games Workshop, and we're going to do this Angels of Death project, and I really want you to be a part of it. And that was like an easy, automatic yes. No Like no questions asked, no like when does it start? What do you need? Just it was like yes. What do you need? No, no, I don't need to know anymore. I'm good. Yes. And part of it too is that like I kind of joke, but it's true. Is like my relationship with Warhammer and Games Workshop like was longtime fan to maybe super uber fan, where like I was building and painting thousands of models and armies and things like that, and kind of friend and then company man. So somewhere around uber fan to friend in maybe 6 7 years ago, I became very friendly with a number of the great concept designers and painters and sculptors and people at Games Workshop who do Warhammer. So like John Blanche, who's one of the, in my opinion, John Blanche and Jez Goodwins are some of the kind of yin and yang of what makes Warhammer Warhammer. John is a dear friend and has been for many, many years, and I've made several trips up to Nottingham, England, before I ever compose anything for them, for gaming events, to go visit Warhammer World and to play games with the people who create Warhammer. So it was already kind of part of my thing. A lot of my closest mates are people who worked for the company for 15, 20 years. And so when I had the opportunity to score the music, I was like, it just felt like coming home in a sense. Like I already knew half the designers. I already knew half the sculptors. I love the stuff that they make. I'm like a true Blue fan all the way through. And then they're like, yeah, now we'd like you to write music for it. I was like, yeah, I mean, I was absolutely chuffed. It was like, why wouldn't I do that? That's, yeah, yeah.
So, what do you think the fans will do with this series? Will they embrace it? How did you come? Because there's a big fan base. It's like it's almost Star Wars level when it comes to
Yeah.
Warhammer.
It is. So it's something that's really interesting, especially, I mean, I've been on board the Warhammer train since 1985, right? I've been from the beginning. But it's kind of funny because there's a very different perception of it, like when I'm in the UK and working, and then when I'm in the States. So the States is a broad audience and it's getting larger and larger and larger. But it's still kind of specific and kind of niche, right? Where like sometimes in Hollywood, I'll meet producers who are like, "Oh man, I love that, I love that," and then other people are like, "I don't know what this is." Whereas in the UK, everyone has grown up and has a mate who grew up playing Warhammer. It's like who doesn't? It's kind of like in the States, everyone knows somebody who played Dungeons and Dragons growing up in school, right? So the fan base is just so powerful and so amazing, and so far they've really embraced it in such an incredible way where there's a lot of love. Like the first time I kind of had a chance to experience that was when we did their global their ident, their production logo, which is going to go in front of all their media. And so in early December, we went to London and recorded a 90-piece orchestra and choir at Air Studios.
Wow, that must have been amazing.
It was unreal. It was absolutely unreal. So, Air Studios is this incredible church that was converted into a studio back in the 70s by George Martin, who produced the Beatles. And George had also gone and, like developed Abbey Road and built that as a studio. And it's kind of like Hans Zimmer's studio of choice. He does everything there, right? And so my engineer worked for Hans for many years, and he was like, I can't wait till we go because this is going to be just the best. So the sound of the room was incredible. This massive orchestra. I didn't even find out until like I did. It was a bit of a kitchen sink kind of like job where like it just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger because it felt like the brand and the universe is so massive. You need something that's like a wall of sound to feel like it's appropriate for what it is. And I didn't even know until halfway through the session we had a break, and I was talking to the percussionist, and we had a massive percussion array, like 22 giant drums, giant daiko drums from Japan, and North African giant dunduns, and just timpani, and I was chatting with the guys. We had 16 percussionists, and they said, this is the largest percussion recording session in all of London in 2019.
Wow, very cool.
Really? They're like, yeah. It's like, no one told you. I was like, no, I just kept writing more and more and more. And they were like, no, this is right. And so when we did that, it was like, I felt like it was an incredibly auspicious way to launch Warhammer as a media thing outside of the video games, right? And to be fair, like the guys at Games Workshop have been so incredibly supportive in terms of my vision for where this could be and what this could be, in terms of size and scope. And they've given me a very long leash to explore that so far. And so hopefully all that's been, that trust has been repaid. But it was so embraced by the fans in such an incredible way when they launched that out and first showed it in January. I was just absolutely shocked by it. And I think like I just had so many letters and emails and texts and Instagram messages and I'm really hoping that as the rest of this media starts to come out, the fans will really love it as much as we've loved making it, you know? And we think it's super cool. And I know it's just our limited opinion because we're in it, looking at it every day. Um, but I think that's really exciting. And I think one of the other things that's kind of exciting too is that Games Workshop is um, engaged in making lots of media right now. So Angels of Death is the first thing that's kind of been produced and people will see. But they've also already announced and shown some trailers for another project called Hammer and Bolter, which is an anthology animated series. And that show, every episode explores a different kind of corner of the intellectual property of Warhammer and, things maybe the fans have heard about but never actually seen happen. And just yesterday, I guess we can officially announce it because they announced it on the Warhammer community site. We've officially announced that there's a third animation project as well, which is like a black and white kind of like hard-boiled kind of crime noir kind of influence thing that's called Interrogator.
Wow, sounds very cool.
Yeah.
Will you be involved in that?
Yeah, I'm scoring that as well.
Fantastic, very very cool. You must be very excited, like a kid in a toy box,
Literally a kid in a toy box. Yeah, I mean, let's be honest. In the end, they're kind of a toy company of sorts, a model company. Literally a kid in a toy box. It's super fun.
Yeah, my brother and I have great fond memories of the character, the little Marines that you're painting along, and then the games came along. So this world is just getting larger and larger.
Yeah.
Now that you've done one of or you're still doing, I always like to ask if budget wasn't an issue, or you just happened to link up with the right person at the right time, and it was like the dream job. Are there characters or films that you would love to score around
that haven't been done yet, or like if you could go back in time and do something? Okay. Well, I mean, the Warhammer stuff, to be honest, is really way up there given my fandom. If I was going outside of the Warhammer stuff, there's a part of me. Well, there's two actually. I'll put two of them out there. One of them is actually kind of in development now, which is the Cyberpunk 2077 video game has an animated series that's being done right now called Edge Runner, and that is like way up my alley. I grew up playing role-playing games in Cyberpunk 2020 and, had a steady diet of everything related to that kind of stuff. And, yeah, when I heard about that recently, I was like, oh, do they have a composer yet? That'd
be so cool.
Yeah. It's like, well, especially too, like I grew up, watching things like Akira and a lot of anime. And, if you had something that had some of that edge and maybe a little bit of a synthwave kind of element to it and kind of, meets Blade Runner or whatever, that's super exciting. A lot of the Dune stuff is really exciting too. Like I'm not gonna be scoring that. I know Hans is knee deep in working on that right now. I point this way because he's just like 14 blocks that way. Yeah. But that's another kind of giant sci-fi, property that I always found like really fascinating. Yeah.
Because the world looks very different now and a lot of people are working from home and probably will do, even as things change and go back to normal, there'll be a new norm. For people wanting to do what you do, especially youngsters, I have a 15-year-old boy who loves messing with music. What would you say to this kind of new generation that wants to kind of do what you do? Would you go get a degree, or is it more now just playing and getting your work out there?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's a hard question because I came up in such a totally different era, I came up in a very analog era that became digital, I guess I would say this. I think that there's a lot of real value to exploring the idea of going to university and getting a degree. And to some degree, I think that's functional in terms of, I think there's a lot of things just about music and being exposed to things that I received through my university training that maybe I would have eventually found myself, but like I found faster because of that, right? And some of it was because of the actual coursework and the way it was structured, but a lot of it was just, having great musicians that I had as mentors that I could be around and I could talk to all the time. And they could say, hey, are you familiar with Brazilian music? What do you think about Milton Nascimento? Or, let me play this record for you. Or, what do you know about this? Or have you ever checked this out? Or have you ever listened to Bela Bartok? Have you ever checked out Steve Reich? Have you ever checked out, Igor Stravinsky's stuff other than The Rite of Spring? Those kinds of things, which again, if you're a very inquisitive person, I think in this digital era, you have access to almost anything. I remember going in like aggressively searching out rare records because you could hope to find a copy. And now I can like Google it and, oh, it's on YouTube. Let me go listen to it. Right. And I remember being like, man, I hunted for that thing for 8 months back in the day when there was only physical copies. Right. So I think there's like a weird thing where the entire world is available at your fingertips, and being able to take advantage of that and being inquisitive is great. But I think there's also something to be said for maybe having some sort of structure and having people that can kind of like help curate that, and kind of guide. And maybe that ends up being like a private thing where you're like, hey, I know somebody and I just chat with them all the time. Like there are a lot of great composers here in Hollywood that moved here when they were 18 or 19 and they went making coffee and tea for Hans Zimmer and they were assistants and they worked their way up. Like I think that's just as valid and a legitimate way of doing it as a form of apprenticeship. One thing I would say about university to some degree is having some foundational musical skills are really helpful in terms of, even if you think like, well, I'm just going to play guitar and I'm going to be a band and that's what I'm into, you never know where your life's going to take you. And there are things that I'm doing now, like writing for a 90-piece orchestra and choir, that I never had the opportunity to do in the earlier areas of my career when I was just a jazz musician and playing in a 5-piece group. But I had a lot of that training in kind of conventional orchestration. And can a viola actually play that note? Can they, is this too hard on a trombone to actually physically play? Like those kinds of things, you'd be surprised how they come back to you later on in your life and you go, oh, I'm super glad that I learned that like the English horn can't play that or this is tricky, let me write that easier or whatever. So I think there's a balance. I think there's something to be said though for like not getting too stuck into the university mindset and anticipating that necessarily creates the opportunity or the job for you. It's more to kind of give you that education base. And for me, during my university years, I was always performing and always gigging. So I think in this era with COVID, I think that you can't be gigging all the time, but I think you have to be creating, like endlessly creating, and small things, big things, whatever you can do and putting it out there. That's the one advantage of the technology is anyone can start to get things out there and be heard, which that's worth exploring. Like I would always encourage any young musicians, like keep making, creating, and putting it out there. No matter what you think of it, good, you think it's great, maybe it's not your best work, just keep making stuff because the world is listening.
Is there anything else you would like to say on the creative, how the whole thing comes together? Because I know it's different for each project.
Yeah.
And I've spoken to a couple of composers who have a whole different, like each composer has a different creative route, I guess. What does a day in a life look like for you when you start composing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I tend to start pretty early. I used to be in this kind of position where, as a musician, I was working super late, like up all night and, playing gigs and stuff like that. And then weirdly enough, when I kind of got into scoring for different media projects, TV and film and so forth, I just kind of flipped my schedule. So when I know I'm in the middle of a project, I tend to try to get up as early as humanly possible now. Like I've become like a morning person, like 5, 6 in the morning. Because if I get into the studio by 7 a.m., I know I can try to get a good 4 or 5 hours in before all the phone calls start and all the emails start to catch up, right? And so for me, it's kind of more about having that quiet time, knowing that like I can try to be super productive for those 5 hours. And I've kind of just trained myself over time that to kind of ignore what hour it is in terms of like, oh, I'm not feeling inspired. Like, no, you just kind of have to go in and write every single day, right? And sometimes it's a little bit, mechanical, like, maybe this isn't the best thing I've ever written, but I have to get my minutes done. I have to get in my pages every single day. So I tend to be like very focused that way. And then kind of trusting that I can kind of revisit things and go, let me re-edit. Like that's another thing I think that's super important is that even if your first instincts feel like they're solid, just realizing like I think a big part of composing is rewriting and editing and adjusting and coming back to it with a fresh set of ears. Like you might think it's great, give it a day, come back and listen to it. And even if the musical thing makes sense, is it mixed well? You know what, this element's too loud, or maybe the bass needs to be louder or soft. Like even just coming back with fresh sets of ears, because your ears get tired over the course of a day, right? And so I just kind of come back and I reevaluate everything. And then sometimes you don't have a choice. Like sometimes you get to the point where, the deadline's coming up and you just, it has to get, I had a showrunner who used to say, not all these children are pretty, but they all have to get on the school bus, right? Like this, especially when it's like, hey, this thing airs next Friday night. Like we have to get it out the door and get it off to the mix and make sure it's done to the best quality we can. So I kind of like that thing about television, because I think that there's a kind of like high wire act about it that feels like precarious in any given moment, and you kind of get addicted. It's like an adrenaline junkie kind of thing. Like, can we actually get this done? And we've got 2 hours left, right? And it gets out there. And I think that's kind of fun. Like, especially when you're talking about the shows, there's some of those episodes of Superstition were so panic induced. Like, oh my God, we've got 3 days to turn this thing around because, something happened, or we need to get it, ready. And, picture came to us later than we thought or whatever. And just kind of being super nimble was like a big part of that job. And some of those episodes are kind of blurs to me. Like when I go back, I'm like, oh yeah, that's what we did. I forgot, because you're just kind of in this high of like working and running. And so that's kind of the way I tend to do it. And if I can, I try to keep like relatively normal sane hours and get out 5-6 p.m. Obviously, like yesterday I did a 14-hour day. I'm not gonna lie. Like it was, we recorded some great vocalists and we had to edit them, and it just took however long it took. So I keep the studio relatively close to the house, so I'm not commuting an incredibly long distance. It's like a 5-minute trip back home, and that way I can still see the family and have dinner, and if I have to come back in, that's okay. And that's just day after day after day after day, and then suddenly you've got hundreds of hours of, accumulated stuff.
When you're composing, do you like to have visual representation of the project you're working on?
Yeah, yeah. I'm a really visual guy when it comes to writing, and I've had a number of projects where I've done stuff just as scripts, and that's always a little harder for me. Like if they want early stage stuff, even in those situations, if I only have script and I don't have picture yet, I really try to like, can you send me visual references? Can you show me, what do these characters look like? Can you show me like concept work of what the sets are going to look like or whatever? Some of the hammer and bolter stuff that we've been doing, in animation, you often work to early animatics, which are kind of initial sketches, but they'll get completely fleshed out later, with full backgrounds. And in those situations, it's been incredibly helpful. Just like, can you send me over just even the character designs? Can I see better like 3D representations of what these people look like? And, like what's this girl's deal? Is she, kind of dangerous, or she's sneaky, or she's super smart, or, what's this guy's deal? Oh, well, he's kind of shifty, or what, he's actually secretly the mastermind behind the whole thing, or whatever. And then being able to see that helps me. I also find that like, that visual part is really important because, it sounds obvious, but we're like scoring the visual media. And there's such a thing as like, you want to make sure that whatever you're doing is like fully supporting actor performances on there, as well as like the overall arc of the story. And I never want to like put in too much music in a way that like detracts from, let's say, actor performance. My attitude is like,
Where it tries to be a main character even though that's not what's asked for, because sometimes you can, and it is, and it drives the story. But if that's the case, it's one of the worst things, and you notice it, and it will ruin whatever you're watching.
yeah, I feel like sometimes, weirdly enough, the nicest compliment I ever get is if someone's like, oh yeah, you did that show, that was a really good show, I didn't notice the music. You're like, that's okay, I'm okay with that, because I feel like when it's bad, they always notice. Like when it's really bad, they're always, oh, the music, oof. If you're just kind of there and you're kind of doing what you're supposed to do and supporting it, I feel like that's really the gig. And then every once in a while, maybe once in an episode or a couple big moments in a movie, you get to have that moment where you get to be the top dog and have your moment and kind of like cheer for yourself, and then go back to playing that supportive role. Uh, but I think it's really important. I've had a number of producers over the years get really shocked or surprised when we've been, let's say, on a final mixing dub stage, where you're mixing all the final elements, the dialogue and sound effects and music. I get the sneaking suspicion I'm the only composer they've ever worked with who ever asked them to dump music and go, do we really need me there? Can we just, I know I wrote a thing here and you like it and everything. Can we just, like, what if we didn't have it? Like, what if we just cut it? Like, kill your darlings, just remove it. And I've had a number of producers be like, I've never had a composer do that in a mix. They're always asking for it to be louder. And you're like, you know, like, if you're like, it's working, if what's working, if the actors are working and it sounds great and looks great, like, that's the first question I always have when we look at a piece of any media is like, what am I doing here? Like, like, why do you need me? Like, I always feel like I'm trying to like justify my own existence as a job. Like, why do you need me here? Like, do you really need me here? Because this is great. Like, I don't, and then you kind of get a better sense of like, well, we need to set up the next scene where, you got to build up the optimism and take it away, or we got to make them think that this thing's going to get turned sideways, it gets spooky, and you're like, oh, okay. Then I know what I'm doing. As long as I know what I'm doing tone wise and how I'm supposed to support the story, it's easier. I think the hardest jobs are when people are still trying to figure that out and there's maybe a lack of clarity.
Mm.
You know?
Yeah. Has there been projects where you've not liked the outcome without mentioning names or putting anyone under the bus? Is there, you look back now and go, oh man, I wish I had like months more or days?
Oh, I always wish I had more time, like without question. I've never had a job where I was like, oh, I had way too much time and we just had all the time in the world to do it. And I think I could go back to every single gig, no matter what it was. Oh, if I had 10 more hours or 2 more days, yeah, without question. Yeah, there's some things that when they come out, everything's imperfect. You know what I mean? And at a certain point, the deadline catches up to an entire project, and it has to come out no matter what. And I think the thing is, I'm a lot more forgiving of like my own media tastes now as a professional than I maybe was as a fan, because I know how hard it is to make something. You know, so as a fan, I might have been like, how come they killed off that character, and why did they get rid of that person, and they were amazing, and then in season 3 they just got rid of them, and like, for all you know, is like a contract dispute, and or like the guy, or gal broke their leg and then they weren't available for 2 months, or there's a million things that happen, you know what I mean? Or like the budget for catering disappeared, so therefore, they were like, I'm done with this gig because I like the lunch, I'm only here for the free lunch, or whatever. Like, I've had a show. I'll give you an example, and I won't say what the project was, but there was once a thing I did in. This is an exaggeration, but it gives you a sense of sometimes what Hollywood is, which is like the pitch was like, here's the scene, it's amazing, and like they're on a space shuttle and they're doing this thing, and it's incredible, and then they're like 2 weeks later, like, turns out we can't afford to do the space thing, so now it's on like a 747, and they're like, okay, 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 cool, and then it's like later on they're like, oh, we have a school bus, so this is going to be on a school bus, and you're like, okay, okay. They're like, turns out we can get like we can get a Skoda, but we can't actually get a school bus, and you're like, okay, and then like Skoda's out, it's all bicycles, you know what I mean? And it happens in different ways sometimes in projects, just because projects are always, the last job I would ever want to be is like a film or television producer. I don't even know how those people have the fortitude to do it, because they're creatively problem solving a million, putting out a million fires every day. And that's just the nature of the job. And so inevitably you have to make creative decisions that are also based on timing and budget. And we wanted to do this thing, but then the sun set and we couldn't get it shot in time, or, now it has to be a night scene, or there's, and I think if fans really understood that every single thing that they've ever known and loved actually has decisions that have gone into it that were like that, they'd be surprised. And so, I feel like a big part about composing is you just kind of have to go with the flow, and like someone will come to you with a schedule, or they'll say it's going to be this way or that way, and we want it to be this way. And you have to just really understand that at any given time, it'll shift, and you kind of have to like shift accordingly, musically or in your plans, in terms of, oh, we have half as much time as we have. Like, the greatest lesson I ever had, my first job, is I worked for John Ottman, who did all the X-Men movies. And I was a technical assistant for him. I helped him rebuild his studio and set up his computers. But it was amazing just to be adjacent to that and see how you do big studio motion pictures. And one of the greatest lessons I ever had, John scored this movie called The Losers, which is a Warner Brothers film that I think is an amazing movie.
I love it. It's great.
Yeah, And I think that like people have caught on to it over time as a cult classic. And it has a ton of amazing, super well, like incredibly famous actors. Like
Cast, yeah. Yeah.
like right before they were famous, like they were known but not famous, right? So like Idris Elba is in it, and Zoe Saldana's in it, and Chris, what's his name, Captain America, Chris Evans is in it, and all these, and Jeffrey Dean Morgan's in it. But it was like right before all of them were like mega famous, right? And one of the things, the lessons I learned, like watching him do that movie, was I remember that originally, like he was working on that movie, and let's say it was January, and the movie was going to come out in like May, right? And he's like, "Oh, I have all this time." And then they changed the date because the A-Team was coming out, and they wanted to compete with the A-Team. So then suddenly we were like moved forward, and suddenly the movie was going to be due in February. And so like he was like, "Oh, I have like 4 months. Oh, I have 4 weeks," right? And then suddenly he was like writing, and then they changed the release date again, and I think it went to like late April or something like that. He's like, "Oh, now I have 8 weeks," or whatever it was. And it was a real wake up call to me, and like a lesson of like, oh, okay, this stuff changes, and you can't get entrenched in some sort of like you can't become ossified and like, oh, this is the way it is, and that's the way it is, and I'm not going to change or be flexible. And so I think a big part about it is trying to like, this high wire act of trying to do great creative work and under constantly changing circumstances. You know.
Hated something and you give it to them and they go, no, we don't like that. Um, have you had to
Oh,
deal with that before?
oh yeah, that's like the most stressful thing in the world. Even when you feel like you've got great relationships with producers or directors, is when you send demos out, and then you sit there and you wait for that phone call or for that email, and then when you see like the caller ID come up, and you're just like, is it good? Is it bad? Right? And then and so I had a young composer who was doing some stuff for me, and I told him, I was like, I think you should start like practicing embracing the note. Like you should like go and like write a piece of music even as a test experience, and then go and write 10 more versions of it. And write 10 versions of it that have ridiculous notes, because sometimes you'll get notes that in your opinion are ridiculous, but they are what they are, and you just like you have to learn to embrace to take the notes, right? Because it's just like you're never going to get away with not getting notes, especially in Hollywood and in media. So like better to get comfortable with embracing that. And also I think it took me a long time to get over this myself, is like understanding that even if you get a note that you disagree with, or maybe you feel like, I question your taste as a human being, like you have to, like initially you might get like really defensive about it, and it took me I think many years to get to the point where I realized like, no, there's a reason why they're giving that note, and you can't just jump to assumptions like and kind of like make them out to be a villain in your mind, right? Because they are imagining something different than you're imagining. They're just imagining something, and they're trying to find their best way to express that in a way that makes sense, like that they can convey it to you so you can interpret that musically. And so like learning to embrace the note, I still get the ingenue. Like I still see the email come up, and I'm like, oh, please be. I feel like it's like you're gambling. Like, please be good, please be good, please be good. Oh, cool. Like, great. Like I get to the point now where it's like, oh, there's only a few notes here, or like they're really specific. Like I can handle that. The hardest notes are when they're vague. You know, I I once worked on and did extra writing on like a a marriage in peril kind of thing, like a Lifetime movie style thing, where they fall in love and they get married, and it turns out the husband's a maniac, right? One of those kinds of movies. And I remember getting notes that came back to us, and they were so I just like they were literally things like, could this piece of music like sound more red, or perhaps it could be more purple, or perhaps and 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 again, the response was like, yes.
But how can you make it more red? What does
I
that
mean,
even mean?
so you kind of have to sit down and go, all right, like, what is that? Like, you have to like kind of start to kind of read tea leaves a little bit, and sometimes you have to take a little bit of a risk and go, maybe what they're really saying is that they want it to be more vibrant or a little more brighter, or more colorful, or maybe they're saying that it needs to seem more violent or something. I don't know. You kind of like, And I kind of find like after a while, you start to you also start to get better at kind of that interpretation, you know. Another thing that I've kind of learned about embracing notes that I think is worth considering, and I think a good piece of advice for young composers is that, um, let's say you're working on something and you think like, oh, it's got to be this, it's got to be this, this is the way it is, trust me. And they're like, no, I think it's blue and it's not red, it's blue. And it's never worth like getting into some sort of giant huff and going, oh my God, it has to be red and like dying on that hill. Like, it's far better to write both. Like, you order this thing that's blue, here's the thing that's blue. By the way, I don't know if you're interested, here's also a thing that's red. And if you want to try that, try that. Like, I think that one of the better kinds of sensibilities about writing music for media is like treating it more like you're a chef, right? Like, if you ask me to cook something for you, Ruben, I'll cook whatever I can for you. I can't know if you don't like onions though, unless you tell me, right? Well, there you go, right? And similarly, too, the other kind of rule of like being a chef is like you can go and cook something that's amazing. You have to like learn to like really relax in terms of like you can't dictate how someone wants to eat it. You know what I mean? And, and I think that's a big part about writing for media is like once you create something and you hand it off, it's theirs. And they're going to have to edit it and they're going to use some of it and then discard other parts of it and things will get shifted around and that's just kind of part of the nature of it. And the sooner you kind of get comfortable with that as a composer, I think the better off you do like professionally, right? Like, you know, you have to just kind of like remove yourself from the process a little bit, you know.
Before we go, let me ask you a couple of nerdy questions. Well, not even nerdy questions, just life questions.
Yeah. Ooh, I'm kind of a cats guy, man. Yeah, I grew up with big dogs. We used to have we had a dog that was an English sheepdog growing up, really big. And then we had another dog that was like part Irish Wolfhound, and I did love them, and they were great dogs. Um, but later on in life, you know, I got married, and my wife had a cat, and I was like, he's okay. But currently, we have a cat now who's just like he's just this orange ginger dreamboat of a guy. And he's kind of a dumb, lovable lug, and he's just the sweetest dude you've ever seen, and he just wants to hang out with you at all times. And he's kind of my number one. Like of all the pets I've had, he's just a great little cat, man. Like I dig him. So I'm kind of into cats right now, but there's a growing pressure. At some point, we might kind of move to a new house, and my daughter's doing a very robust campaign for a dog every day.
How about Marvel or DC?
I'm a Marvel guy. Like that's like there's no waffling on that. And no offense to DC people, you're wrong, but that's okay. Um, no, it's you know what it is. On the DC side, growing up, I was always like a big Batman fan, but more like the detective comics Batman stuff. Not as much like going out and him fighting everybody and being Batman, you know, superhero Batman. More like the world's greatest detective Batman. That was more attractive and interesting to me. Uh, on the Marvel side, I was always like a massive Spider-Man fan, you know, and I kind of grew up in an era in the '80s, like with all the Hobgoblin stuff, and you know, who is the Hobgoblin, and you know what, you know, all that kind of stuff, and the black suit when it first showed up, and you know, and coming out as a little kid out of Secret Wars, the original Secret Wars. And I always kind of liked that it felt like it was in a real place, like those people lived in Manhattan and they were doing stuff, and then, like it was real. And we obviously it's not, but it was real. Um, yeah, so the Marvel part for me was always like a big, big,
Who's your
big
favorite Spider-Man live action?
a live action. Uh, that's hard, man. I feel like Andrew Garfield doesn't get like the cred he deserves. I think like feel like he did a really great Spider-Man. But that being said, like the latest ones, like the Tom Holland ones they're really amazing. They're super fun and they I think they're the first ones that like genuinely make him feel like he's Peter Parker teenager. Like as great as the first ones that came out were, you know, with Tobey Maguire, they always felt like here's like a 28-year-old man trying to
Acting
be
as a younger one. Yeah, I can understand that. Yeah.
right. So that yeah, that was kind of one of those things for me that I was like, I don't know about that. I also liked a lot of other things that were kind of like little bit off the beaten path. Like I grew up, I was a really big Swamp Thing fan. Uh, so I kind of liked that weird body horror and like weird existential dilemma stuff of like the classic 80s run of Swamp Thing where, what am I? I don't even know what I am anymore. I'm this creature, but am I even that person? Am I, I liked that weirdness of like Swamp Thing and, uh, and Constantine, which came out of Swamp Thing. I always kind of dug stuff like that. And I was also like a really gigantic, like Akira, like manga fan. Like I collected all the original ones in black and white and, it was like a gazillion issues by the time it was done. But that was a big thing for me too, growing up.
So do you have, do you watch anime?
I do a bit now. It's like this kind of weird thing where like I find myself constantly wishing I could catch up and watch more things, but I'm always working, right? So like you're just constantly chasing, right? Like I recently watched the Castlevania stuff. I was super kind of excited about that. That was fun to watch. But yeah, I feel like there's like an endless list of shows, and I'm always chasing, all the
I
shows.
can understand that. There's always so much content as well, new stuff coming out all the time. Akira has been the live action that's been in the works for years now.
I know.
Would you dare? Because it's such a well loved. It's like the anime that kind of brought many people into the world of manga and anime.
Yeah.
If you were offered that, would you take?
I mean, you'd have to take it. You'd have to take it. Like, and then you'd be absolutely terrified because you like have to absolutely thread the needle of like the perfect version of that thing, or then you're hated.
Yeah,
right?
I just don't know that you could make the fans, everybody happy. I mean, you never can, really.
No, I mean, I think I think one of the challenges of anything like that is that it's such a beloved thing that everybody has. I'll give you an example. I had a movie recently that I was talking to the producers, and I still may end up doing, but they asked me to do some demos to pitch for it, and I did, and they were really thrilled with the demos, and then they asked for a few more, and I had this very pleasant but frank conversation with the director where I was like, respectfully, whatever I write, I hope you're enjoying it and you seem to like it, and that's great, but respectfully, I can't live up to the movie that exists in your head, right? Because it hasn't been made yet. And so the imaginary version of the movie that exists in your head is ideal. Like everything that you wanted, it is there because there's no restrictions, right? And then the thing that actually gets made is never going to live up to that ideal, it just can't. Right? So I think that's like one of those like damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of scenarios where you look at it and go, you have to say yes because you want to do it. It's super challenging. I mean, I've seen that with even close friends. One of my dearest, closest personal friends is Andy Cosby, who wrote the Hellboy movie that came out last year.
Oi.
And there's a lot of things about that film that, like, in the end, as the screenwriter, he can't control because they go out and they film and they do whatever whatever they're going to do. He didn't do that part. He wrote the screenplay. And it's really challenging because when they asked him an approach to do Hellboy, you're like, of course I'm going to do Hellboy. He's like the biggest Hellboy fan in the universe. Andy Cosby just, like, breathes Hellboy. Like he just knows it, sleeps, eats, dreams Hellboy, and he was the perfect guy to approach on it. And I remember kind of as his best friend living with him for like 2 years and reading early drafts and talking to him about it and all the different iterations and incarnations as it was going. And there's so many different things that could have been that movie. And in the end, like you're the screenwriter, you kind of have to let go because you're not the director and you're not the producer and you're not in charge of how that's going to go. And it's that, but it was hard for me personally for him because that was a hard one to handle because like there are factions of the Hellboy fans that feel like that, and even Mike Mignola in many ways I think feels like that's a very authentic representation of Hellboy compared to the comic books, the sensibility of what he is. But it's so different than the Guillermo del Toro ones, and people created this idealization of like, well, this is what Hellboy is because Guillermo del Toro has set this and framed this thing as this is what Hellboy is. And I think that there's just a lot of properties that are like that, where you kind of have to look at it and go, I have to say yes, I want to be a part of this thing, but I can only control one. I'm like the chef. Like I don't, like if I cater your wedding, I don't get to decide how long you stay married.
Yeah, that's a good example, actually. Yeah. Fantastic. Oh, thank you so much for your time. It's been great to talk to you.
Same here.
I'm really looking forward to some of your future work with Warhammer. Hopefully we can chat again about that future work. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.